The wedding flowers were still fresh when she vanished. Not a note, not a farewell, only the pale ghost of her gloves abandoned upon the church pew, and the faint trace of rosewater that lingered in the stone air long after Seraphine Ashby had dissolved into the grey morning mist of London. Caspian Drelincourt, Duke of Aldenmere, had stood at that altar and felt the world rearrange itself into something unrecognizable. He had not trembled at Waterloo. He had not flinched when his father died cold and silent in the Aldenmere library. But standing before 200 of England's finest, watching those carved oak doors remain closed, something fractured inside him that no surgeon in the kingdom could have repaired. No one knew why she ran, not the bishop who stood frozen mid-scripture, not Lord Bertrand Fovell, who had arranged the match with suspicious haste and now wore confusion like a costume, not even Seraphine's own mother, who collapsed into her chair and wept as though the world itself had ended at the altar. The Duke said nothing. He turned. He walked the full length of that aisle with his head raised and his face stone, climbed into his carriage and drew the curtains shut. For 3 years the name Seraphine Ashby was never spoken aloud in his presence again. But the questions never stopped. Why had she run? What had she known? And why, on the very morning of their wedding, had she slipped a single folded letter beneath his breakfast tray, a letter that he, distracted and dressed for ceremony, had never thought to open? That letter still lived in his coat pocket, 3 years later, seal unbroken, still waiting. And so was he. 3 years is a long time in English society, long enough for scandal to fade into gossip, for gossip to curdle into rumor, and for rumor to dissolve into the comfortable fog of collective forgetting. The ton had moved on, new fortunes had been wagered, new marriages arranged, new secrets pressed beneath freshly laid floors. Caspian Drelincourt had not moved on. He was a man of controlled exterior and turbulent interior, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, possessing the quiet authority that made footmen stand straighter and lords choose their words with greater care. He governed Aldenmere with efficiency and attended Parliament with discipline. He refused every invitation from mothers with eligible daughters and was considered by universal agreement both the most desirable and the most unreachable man in England. What no one saw was that he still thought about her, not only with bitterness, though some of that lived in him too, but with a question that gnawed at him in the small hours. Had she been afraid of him or afraid of something else entirely? Seraphine Ashby, meanwhile, had become someone else. She lived now in the quiet market town of Dunhollow, 3 days' ride north of London, under the name Miss Wren. She gave music lessons to the daughters of merchants. She kept a modest cottage near the river, wore plain dresses, unpinned her hair, and smiled at her neighbors with a warmth that no one would have ever associated with the scandalous runaway bride of the Duke of Aldenmere. She had built a careful life, a quiet life, and every single morning for 3 years she had prayed that Caspian Drelincourt would never find her. She should have known that prayers answered too easily are often answered far too late. It was a Tuesday when the black carriage rolled into Dunhollow. It bore no crest, but the horses were too fine, the coachman too composed, and the figure who stepped onto the cobblestones far too familiar. Seraphine was crossing the market square with a basket of sheet music when she saw him. She stopped breathing entirely. He had changed in the ways pain changes a man, something sharpened around the jaw, something quieted behind the eyes. He scanned the square slowly, deliberately, as though he had been told exactly what or who to look for. She turned and walked quickly in the other direction, not running. Running would draw attention. She kept her steps measured, her spine straight, every lesson of aristocratic composure flooding back into her bones like cold water. She had nearly reached the far lane when his voice reached her. "Miss Wren." She stopped. Not because she owed him obedience, but because the way he said it, flat, precise, and yet carrying something beneath it that sounded almost like relief, made her legs simply refuse to move. She turned slowly. Caspian stood 6 feet away, hat in hand, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an expression she could not name. Not fury, not cruelty, something far more dangerous than either. "You have been exceptionally difficult to locate," he said quietly. "Your Grace," her voice was steadier than she felt. "You, Seraphine." Her name fell from his lips like something he had been holding in his chest far too long. "Do not." But before the Duke could say another word, and before Seraphine could decide whether to confess everything or disappear once more, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Duke's Lost Letters. Every subscription helps this channel keep bringing you these unforgettable Regency romance stories filled with secrets, heartbreak, and forbidden love. Now, back to Seraphine and the secret she had been carrying completely alone for 3 long years. She let him inside the cottage, not willingly, but a scene in the square was the one thing she could not afford. The cottage was small and immaculate. Sheet music covered every surface. Above the fireplace, pinned slightly crookedly, was a child's drawing in bright, lopsided colors. Caspian's eyes found it immediately, and then went utterly still. Seraphine watched his face. She watched the calculation happen, the arithmetic of time assembling itself behind those dark eyes. She watched the exact moment he understood. "How old?" he asked. The words were barely sound at all. 2.5, she said. The silence that followed was not angry. It was enormous. It was the silence of a man discovering that the 3 years he had spent believing himself abandoned had in fact been 3 years during which he had unknowingly been a father. "You knew," he cracked, only slightly, only once. "You knew on the morning of our wedding." "I suspected," said Seraphine carefully. "I was not certain until weeks later." "And yet you ran." He looked at her not with cruelty, but with something far worse, with grief. "Rather than tell me." Her chin rose. "I ran because Lord Fovell came to me the night before our wedding and told me that you had arranged the match solely to acquire my family's debt, that the moment we were married you intended to dissolve my father's estate entirely and install his man in the property, that I would be a wife in name only, kept comfortable and kept silent." Her voice did not shake, though each word cost her something. "I believed him. I was wrong to believe him without demanding the truth from you directly. I know that now, but I was 19 and terrified, and the letter I left you is still sealed." She stared at him. "What?" He reached into his inner coat pocket and withdrew a folded square of paper, yellowed slightly at the edges, the original wax seal unbroken. "I have carried it for 3 years, he said. "I was afraid of what it might tell me."
What Seraphine had not known, what she could not have known, hidden away in Dun Hollow, was that Fovell's interference had not ended with her wedding morning. In her absence, he had worked methodically to destabilize the Duke's reputation in Parliament, circulating whispers that Aldenmere's finances were failing, that his erratic personal conduct made him unfit for political trust. He had even produced correspondence, forged, as it was later exposed, allegedly written by Seraphine herself, claiming the Duke had treated her with coldness and that her flight had been nothing less than a desperate escape from cruelty. Society had half believed it. The Duke had refused to defend himself publicly, unwilling to drag Seraphine's name through the courts when he still did not know where she was or what she had suffered. He had protected her reputation even while believing she had abandoned him entirely. When Caspian told her this, quietly, without self-pity, seated across from her in that small firelit cottage, Seraphine felt every wall she had so carefully constructed crumble inward. "He used my fear to separate us," she said, "and then used my absence to destroy you." "Yes," Caspian's jaw was tight. "When I uncovered the forgeries 6 months ago, I began searching for you, not to demand answers, not to compel you back." He paused. "I needed to know only that you were safe." She looked at him for a long, unguarded moment. "And now that you have found me?" He said nothing immediately. He rose instead and crossed to the fireplace, studying the child's drawing with the particular stillness of a man encountering something irreversible. A house, a garden, 2 figures, one with dark hair, one with light, standing side by side. "What is her name?" he asked. Seraphine's voice was soft. "Clara." He asked to meet her. Seraphine stood in the doorway of the small back room, while Clara, dark-eyed, solemn, unmistakably her father's daughter, regarded the tall stranger in the good coat with the fearless, evaluating curiosity particular to very small children. Caspian crouched to her height. He looked at her the way men look at something they did not know they had been missing until the precise moment it appeared before them. "Hello," he said. Clara considered him gravely. "Your buttons are very shiny," she announced. Something crossed his face then, quiet and devastating and entirely beyond his control. He looked up from Seraphine, from where he knelt on the worn floorboards, and 3 years of silence and grief and sealed letters lived in his expression. But underneath all of it, burning through all of it, was something that bore an unmistakable resemblance to love. "I will not pretend," he said carefully, his eyes still holding hers, "that the past 3 years were anything less than devastating. I will not pretend I was not angry, that I did not feel the absence of you every single day." He paused. "But I am not here to ask you to account for any of it. I am here because I should have opened that letter, because I should have come to find you far sooner, because I was a man so frightened of being wrong about you that I never gave you the chance to tell me the truth yourself." The cottage was completely still. The fire crackled softly between them. "Open the letter," Seraphine said. He broke the seal. 3-year-old ink, slightly faded at the margins, urgent and young and honest. He read it in silence. When he finished, he folded it with great care and pressed it to his chest. "You told me you loved me," he said. "I did. I still do. I was only afraid." They did not marry in a grand London church surrounded by 200 guests. They married quietly in Dunhollow parish on a rain-softened April morning, with no audience beyond the vicar, a neighbour who wept delightedly into her shawl, and Clara, who spent the entire ceremony crouched at the church steps, absorbed in the examination of a beetle she had discovered in the moss. Lord Fauvel's forgeries were exposed before winter's end. His political standing disintegrated quietly, and without the dignity he had always believed himself deserving of. The Duke of Aldenmere returned to London the following season with his wife on his arm and his daughter perched upon his shoulders. Society, being what it always is, found it enormously romantic in retrospect, and claimed they had always suspected a love story of this magnitude was unfolding. But in the private moments, the early mornings in the Aldenmere library, the long evenings when the fire burned low and the world outside was hushed and still, Caspian would sometimes retrieve that letter from its place in his desk drawer, worn at the folds now, read 100 times over. He had spent 3 years too afraid to open it. He would spend the rest of his life grateful that he finally did. If this story moved you, if you believe that love, when it is real, finds its way home no matter how long the road, subscribe to the Duke's Lost Letters and share this story with someone who knows that some love stories are worth every year of waiting. Until next time, some letters were never meant to stay sealed.